Hey guys, welcome back to Naily by Nature. My name is Naily. If you are new to this channel, thank you so much for joining me today. And if you have already subscribed, thank you so much. I really am so grateful for your support. So just jumping right into today's video, I wanted to talk about this ongoing war happening right now in Russia and Ukraine. My past two videos has been on the subject, and every day we have been receiving more information about this ongoing war. And I find myself having more questions. And so today's video is basically about, is the US and Russia more alike than we like to believe? Or perhaps more alike than our government and media would like us to believe? And to really be able to answer this question, I feel like I have to talk about Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is at the heart of all of this. And I think that it's important that we acknowledge it, because Afghanistan is also a country that has been invaded by both the US and Russia. It's also one of the poorest countries in the world who could not successfully be ruled and conquered by two of the world's most powerful countries, the US and Russia. So for the past 40 years, Afghanistan has been in a constant state of occupation and war. In Afghanistan's history, it has been ruled by three great empires: the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the US. I would like for people to take a moment to mentally understand and comprehend what it would be like to live in a country that is in a constant state of war and occupation. The emotional distress, the poverty, violence, sexual abuse, child sex slavery, drug addiction, famine. Think how poor your mind can go. That's what's happening in Afghanistan today. That's what the people of Afghanistan have been enduring. When the Soviet Union took over Afghanistan, they implemented their ideals, which overburdened the already impoverished country. They had mass arrests, brutally tortured people, raped women, executed anyone who spoke out against them, continuously bombed rural areas, which is where the majority of Afghanistan's population lives. In an Amnesty International report, it was said that 1 million people died during this period of occupation by the Soviet Union, and more than 8,000 people were executed after being put on trial. So how did the brutal occupation of the Soviet Union end? Here's where the US comes in. During this period of time, the US was also in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so with the help of countries like Pakistan, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the US was able to funnel over $1 billion worth of weapons to the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were the rebels who were fighting against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And so naturally, the US saw an interest to help the Mujahideen, because they were the only people at the time shooting at their enemies, who was the Soviet Union. There's a really amazing movie that I would implore people to watch. It's called Charlie Wilson's War, which basically kind of goes over how this Texas Congress member was able to arrange this takedown of the Soviets by funneling money to the Mujahideen. It really shows who the US is. The irony in all of this is that the Mujahideen would break off into two groups, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, which would later become the US's two biggest enemies. The reason I'm bringing all of this up is because the US invaded Afghanistan with two intentions. One, to destroy terrorist organizations, and to free the people of Afghanistan. And both of these intentions that the US had failed, because the Taliban took over Afghanistan fairly quickly, and the people were obviously not saved by the US.
Panic, chaos, and fear. The hallmarks of the Taliban's conquest of Kabul, Afghanistan's capital and what was the last government stronghold. America's emergency evacuation triggering panic as desperate civilians rushed to the airport in fear for their lives. It's an image that'll stand as a tragic testimony to America's hasty departure. Crowds mobbing the tarmac, so desperate, some clinging for life or death to the departing planes. The pilots put in an unthinkable position. US officials saying at least 3 people were run over and killed by the tires. Local reports saying people could be seen falling from the plane as it departed.
It's actually really humiliating that one of the world's most powerful countries was unsuccessful in bringing democracy to Afghanistan, despite the fact that they were occupying this country for 20 years. And how quickly the Taliban was able to take over the country in a matter of weeks. So what happened during those 20 years of U.S. occupation in Afghanistan? Did the U.S. free Afghan women? According to a Human Rights Watch report, 9 out of 10 women suffer physical violence, sexual abuse, psychological violence, or forced marriage at least once in their lifetime. And this is during the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan. The violence that Afghani women were facing weren't just coming from the Taliban. They were also coming from their home. I think most people in America would say that the violence that is happening to women in Afghanistan isn't a result of U.S. occupation, but rather this is how Afghani people are. This is their culture. This is Islam. This is their religion. This is tribal shit. And it has nothing to do with U.S. occupation and what we came to do there. And this makes sense to me because this is how the media has presented this conflict to us. But rarely do we hear about how U.S. economic sanctions against Afghanistan impacted the country as a whole. Women, children, their healthcare system, their maternal system, their educational system. And this was something that was happening as early as 1999. Earlier in this video, I asked you to mentally put yourself in the shoes of someone who lived in a country that has been in a constant state of war and occupation. How can a group of people ever thrive and make progress if every time they tried, a world power was at their door ready to occupy them, blow them up, shoot them down, and take their land? Of course, a country and its people will be heavily impacted by this. Opium and drug production in Afghanistan exploded 35 times after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan.
Shirzad says while the U.S. and NATO countries have spent a few billion on eradicating drugs, hundreds of billions have been spent on fighting terrorism. He adds Western commanders often told their troops not to destroy poppy fields, fearing it would alienate the rural population. As a result, since the U.S. invasion, drug production has exploded to 35 times what it was in 2001.
The country has a severe drug addiction problem along with child sex slavery that warlords control. And these are all things that the U.S. specifically chose not to interfere with. The greatest threat to the Afghani people was presented to us as just the Taliban. But what about the U.S. and its war and occupation in Afghanistan? The majority of Afghanistan's population lives in rural areas, and these were specific target areas where the U.S. would continuously bomb with drones, killing countless innocent civilians. Not only did the U.S. bomb the shit out of Afghanistan, they also discriminated against many men and young boys who were innocent because they automatically saw them as terrorists. And so they faced extreme torture. And we all know about the horrors that was happening in Guantanamo Bay. Many of the people who were sent to Guantanamo Bay were innocent. And what about the US's pledge to save the people of Afghanistan? What happened to the billions of dollars that was supposed to go to help the people of Afghanistan? Where did that money go? It went to corrupt Afghan government officials that the US placed there, warlords, military corporations, and the rest of the billions of dollars just disappeared. So none of that money actually went to help the Afghani people. It never went to building roads. It never went to building schools. It never went to building hospitals. These are necessities for a country to build a foundation on so that they can actually thrive and become independent. Just recently, Joe Biden decided to freeze $7 billion from Afghanistan's central bank. And this was in a way to, I guess, have the Taliban bow down to the US and all the other Western countries. Basically have the Taliban bow down and kiss the ring. However, the US media barely showed us how much this impacted the Afghani people. People in Afghanistan were unable to withdraw money from the banks. Government officials and teachers were not being paid their salaries. And not to mention how the freeze impacted Afghanistan's import and exports, which devastated their economy. And because of the US, today Afghanistan is facing a major humanitarian crisis. People are dying from hunger. There is a famine crisis happening right now in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan is on the brink of mass starvation. Every single Afghan province is considered food insecure or even in crisis. 23 million Afghans need food assistance. 8.7 million are nearing famine. 1 million children face acute, severe malnutrition and could starve and die this winter. Far more than died in 20 years of war. Schools have no money to pay teachers because the banking system is inoperable. And the healthcare system is near collapse because international assistance that was the source of funding has been frozen.
And so do you want to know how the U.S. put the cherry on top of all of this? Just a week ago, Joe Biden decided to unfreeze Afghanistan's assets, but instead of the money going to help the Afghani people, he decided to split the funds. So half of the $7 billion will go to Afghanistan in aid via U.S. organizations, and the other half will go to 9/11 victims. Do you guys understand what that means? Afghanistan is paying reparations to the U.S., one of the world's most wealthiest countries, and they're paying for a war that they did not start. That to me is like a rape victim having to apologize to their abuser, and not just to apologize, but to take it one step further and pay them for abusing them. None of the 9/11 bombers were from Afghanistan. They were from Saudi Arabia. Not even Osama bin Laden was from Afghanistan. He was from Saudi Arabia. And he wasn't even found in Afghanistan. He was found in Pakistan. I really wanted to make this video today because I have been observing the media lately. Not just receiving information, but also watching how information is being presented to us. I think that the U.S. media has done us a disservice because they have constantly reported on the U.S.'s war crimes as if we have been saviors. When in actuality, we have been extremely destructive and violent to so many innocent civilians. And so when the U.S. reports on the Russia-Ukrainian war and paints Russia as, you know, this big bad guy, I think about the war crimes that the U.S. media and government has covered up. Has the U.S. not been equally destructive to Afghanistan and Iraq? Or what about the weapons we sell to Saudi Arabia to bomb Yemen? Even though the weapons that we are selling to Saudi Arabia has been condemned by the international community. The US media tends to favor Western countries when it comes to reporting news. It shows us how the West is civilized and that the rest of the world is animalistic and uncivilized. But do we not have a corrupt government here in the US? Just because the corruption is not in your face like it is right now in Russia doesn't mean that we don't have the same amount of corruption. Let's take Nancy Pelosi for example. She is the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, and recently she said on the floor that she still holds the position that members of Congress can hold private stock. That shit is a major conflict of interest. This was huge during the early days of the pandemic when members of Congress were pumping and dumping stocks because they had information about COVID-19 before the public did. Politicians are supposed to be public servants, but so many of them are fucking multi-millionaires. How the fuck is that possible when your fucking yearly salary is anywhere between $175,000 to $200,000? Nancy Pelosi is a 100-millionaire. Not only is this a conflict of interest in the sense that members of Congress are privy to information before the public, which allows them to make better decisions when it comes to buying stock, but they can also give out private contracts to corporations. That shit is mad unethical. How can we sit here and judge Russia for invading another country that is not theirs when we here in the US are sitting on land that is not ours? And the US and Canada continue to shit on Indigenous populations. Justin Trudeau is literally hailed as a hero and as perfection to so many liberals. But this motherfucker has been giving out private and public contracts to companies for fracking and drilling on Indigenous land.
When the Prime Minister insists that this pipeline expansion will be done no matter what, and his minister adds that that Canada will not be able to accommodate all Indigenous concerns, what that means is that they have decided to willfully violate their constitutional duties and obligations. Mr. Minister, Mr. Speaker, sounds like a most important relationship, doesn't it? Why doesn't the Prime Minister just say the truth and tell the Indigenous peoples that he doesn't give a fuck about their rights?
And Canada, just like the US, has a very nasty history with the Indigenous population. Just recently, Canada found thousands of graveyards of children from their residential schools because they were fucking killing Indigenous kids. But in the US media, you rarely hear about that. We just hear that Canada is the most kindest and friendliest country in the world. The US and other Western countries inflict so much horror, pain, and suffering on people of color, and they always mask that under the precedence that they are doing it to save us. And people here in the US eat that shit up. Malcolm X has an excellent quote where he says that the white liberal differs from the white conservative because the white liberal is more deceitful. Both want power, but the white liberal has perfected the art of posing as a friend. And the white liberal that Malcolm X is talking about is the US. My intention for this video was to provide another perspective that I don't feel like people are talking about here in the US, especially during this ongoing war with Russia and Ukraine. And maybe this is an opportunity for people in the US and other Western countries to reflect on how the countries we live in is contributing to the pain and suffering of others. Is it fair to say that the US and Russia are more alike than they are different? And should we not hold our own government and country accountable for their war crimes in the same way that we're trying to hold Russia accountable for their war crimes? Why does Afghanistan have to pay reparations to 9/11 victims when the US has still not paid Black Americans reparations for slavery? And slavery lasted for 400 years. At the end of the movie that I recommended, Charlie Wilson's War, Charlie Wilson was a Texas congressman. He was the person who was able to take the budget from $5 million to $1 billion to help the Mujahideen fight off the Soviet Union. And once the Mujahideen was able to fight off the Soviet Union, Charlie Wilson went back to the US government and said, hey, now that we got rid of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, can we get some money to help Afghanistan build schools? And the US government laughed and they said, no, our job is done. And he said, half of Afghanistan's population is under the age of 16. Do you know how dangerous it is when we left them $1 billion worth of weapons? And this really impacted me because I don't think people understand what it's like to build a country up. A country like Afghanistan, who has been through so much trauma for generations, the importance of building a foundation, the importance of building schools and roads and these things are necessary to help a group of people progress, right? I think that the US media likes to portray the US as a savior and that we went and saved Afghanistan from the Soviet Union. But we didn't actually help them because you need to build those things. You need to build schools, you need to build roads, you need to build hospitals. You need to help people so that they can actually rise up together as a group of people. But I think that the US is constantly only looking out for its own interest. And so when we're done fucking up a country, we just kind of, okay, it's on you guys. We did everything we could. I think we all have to acknowledge that history doesn't often reflect the truth. And the people who get to write history are the victors. The people who win the wars are the ones who get to write the narrative. However, today with the help of the internet, we do have an opportunity to rewrite history and to write the history that is happening now. And it's so important that we don't forget the stories of the people who constantly get counted out. Ukraine can become another Afghanistan. It's becoming a battleground for two world powers who are struggling for world dominance. Angelina Jolie said something really beautiful. She said that all of us would like to believe that if we were in a bad situation, someone would help us. And right now, us supporting people who are disproportionately facing violence and suffering, by us just holding our government accountable for its own war crimes, I think that we can make an actual impact on the lives of people who are in need of our help. Holding our government and media accountable for telling us the truth can go a long way. Thank you so much for watching.